The invitation trembled in my hand as I stood frozen in the hallway. My mother's voice carried from the living room, bright and animated on speakerphone. "This is the so I raised," she declared, her laugh dripping with pride. I pressed myself against the wall, stomach churning. Just 3 hours earlier, she'd sat across from me at lunch, her eyes cold as she told me I was wasting my life on childish dreams. Now she was broadcasting my success as if she'd orchestrated every moment. The betrayal sliced through me like broken glass. My name is Harlow Jennings and I'm 28 years old. I'd spent the last 5 years building something from nothing, working in secret because my family's doubt would have crushed me. And now, standing in the shadows of my childhood home, listening to my mother claim credit for everything I'd achieved alone, I felt rage and humiliation crash over me in waves. She didn't build me. She tried to break me. Every single step forward had been mine. I fled to my old bedroom, heart hammering against my ribs. The walls still held posters from high school, faded reminders of simpler times when I believed my mother's words were meant to help me. I sank onto the bed, her criticisms echoing through my mind like a cruel soundtrack. "Stop imagining, Harlow. The world doesn't reward dreamers." She'd said it so many times I'd almost believed her. Almost. The anger burned hot in my chest, mixing with hurt so deep I could barely breathe. Every teacher who praised my creativity, every mentor who saw potential in me, their words had felt hollow under the weight of her constant disapproval. But sitting there, clutching my phone with the gala invitation still pulled up on the screen, I made a silent vow. She would never control my story again. Whatever happened next, whatever success came my way, it would be mine alone. She'd lost the right to be part of my journey, the moment she chose criticism over support. My mind drifted back to my apartment across town, to the cramped second bedroom I'd transformed into my headquarters. That tiny space, barely big enough for a desk and filing cabinet, had become my secret laboratory of dreams. For 18 months, I'd hidden my tech startup from everyone in my family, working late into the night while they assumed I was wasting time on hobbies. The clutter of papers, the coffee-stained notebooks, the prototype devices scattered across every surface, they told the real story of who I was. Every missed family dinner, every declined invitation to brunch, every social event I'd skipped had been fuel for my determination. My younger cousin once asked why I looked so tired all the time. I'd smiled and blamed Netflix binges. The truth was far more exhausting and far more beautiful. I was building an empire in silence, brick by brick, code by code, knowing that when I finally emerged, no one could claim they'd helped me get there. The family brunch 2 months earlier still stung when I thought about it. My older sister Victoria had cornered me near the mimosa table, her voice dripping with condescension. "Harlow, you're dreaming again," she'd said, loud enough for cousins to hear. "When will you face reality? You're almost 30. I'd bitten back tears, my scrambled eggs turning to ash in my mouth. This was my daily existence. A world where my ideas were mocked before they were heard, where ambition was treated like delusion. My mother had nodded along, agreeing that I needed to settle down and find something practical. They spoke about me like I was a child playing dress-up, not a grown woman with a business plan and investors already interested. I'd excused myself to the bathroom and spent 5 minutes staring at my reflection, whispering affirmations I desperately wanted to believe. The fire inside me had burned hotter that day, fueled by their dismissal. They would see. Eventually, they would all see. 3 weeks after that brunch, I'd landed my first real investor meeting. The memory of walking into that downtown office still gave me chills. My hands had shaken as I presented my pitch deck, but my voice had stayed steady. When the lead investor extended her hand and said, "We're in," I nearly collapsed with relief. Success tasted impossibly sweet in that moment of solitude. I celebrated alone in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel as silent tears streamed down my face. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. My family remained blind to everything I'd accomplished, still labeling me impractical and hopeless while I signed contracts and made deals. Every handshake, every partnership agreement, every small victory was a silent step toward vindication. I documented everything obsessively, keeping records not just for business purposes but as proof. Proof that when I succeeded, it would be despite them, not because of them. That distinction mattered more than they could possibly understand. The first time I overheard my mother bragging, I thought it was a mistake. I was visiting for my father's birthday, helping set up in the dining room when her phone conversation drifted through the doorway. I always knew she'd make something of herself, she told whoever was listening. It's the CEO I raised, really. All those tough love conversations paid off. My stomach had twisted violently. Fury and disbelief warred inside me as I stood there holding a stack of plates, unable to move. She believed her own lie. Somehow in her mind, years of criticism and dismissal had transformed into guidance and support. The absurdity would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. I'd set the plates down carefully, afraid I might break something if I held them any longer. That night I'd driven home in a daze, replaying her words over and over. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to lay out the truth in harsh detail. But another part, the part that understood strategy, knew that silence was more powerful. Let her think she was part of the story. Reality would correct her soon enough. Lying in bed that night, memories flooded back with painful clarity. I was 7 years old, showing my mother a story I'd written for school. She'd barely glanced at it before returning to her magazine. "That's nice, dear. Now go clean your room." At 10, I'd won second place in a science fair. She'd missed the ceremony for a hair appointment. At 15, I'd been accepted into a prestigious summer program for young innovators. Do we have to pay for this? Harlow, be realistic about your talents. Birthday parties where my achievements went unmentioned, school recitals she attended but didn't watch, report cards she signed without reading. The neglect had been subtle but constant. It had left me with deep insecurity, a voice in my head that questioned every success and magnified every failure. But it had also forged something harder inside me, a determination so fierce it sometimes scared me. Those memories, painful as they were, explained everything about who I'd become and why my eventual rise would feel so satisfying. Not just to me, but to anyone who'd ever been underestimated by someone who should have believed in them. The public launch of my first product had been carefully orchestrated. We'd released it on a Tuesday morning, and by afternoon, tech blogs were covering the story. I'd watched the views and shares climb from my apartment, barely daring to breathe. By evening we were trending. By the next morning major news outlets had picked it up. I'd been meticulous about remaining anonymous in those early articles, instructing my PR team to focus on the product and the company, not the founder. This strategy served two purposes. It built mystique, and it kept my family in the dark just a little longer. The thrill of watching my creation gain traction, knowing I'd done this without anyone's help or approval, felt better than anything I could have imagined. My phone buzzed constantly with congratulatory messages from investors and team members, people who actually knew what I'd built. Meanwhile, my mother continued her weekly calls, asking about my little hobby, with barely concealed amusement. The gap between her perception and my reality had grown so vast it was almost comical. That Sunday's family dinner had tested every ounce of my self-control. My mother had asked about my computer thing, while passing the roasted vegetables, her smirk suggesting she expected nothing worth hearing. "It's progressing nicely," I'd said, keeping my voice neutral and my eyes on my plate. My father had grunted non-committally. Victoria had rolled her eyes. They had no idea that 3 days earlier, I'd closed a deal worth more than their combined annual salaries. Their casual underestimation fueled something dark and satisfying inside me. Every dismissive comment, every patronizing smile became ammunition. I'd excused myself early, claiming exhaustion, and driven home with my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. In my apartment, I'd pulled up my company's analytics dashboard and stared at the numbers, grounding myself in what was real. Their ignorance was my secret advantage. The longer they remained blind, the sweeter the revelation would be. I wasn't in a hurry. Good revenge, I was learning, required patience. The meeting with Alexandria Foster had changed everything. She was a legend in venture capital, known for her sharp instincts and sharper negotiations. When she'd called my innovation revolutionary, in front of her entire team, I'd had to fight to keep my expression professional. Afterward, in my car, I'd let out a scream of pure joy that probably terrified nearby pedestrians. But more importantly, I'd started documenting everything with renewed intensity. I saved emails, printed letters of recommendation, recorded investor praise, and archived every piece of press coverage. This wasn't just for business records. This was evidence. Proof that my success was mine alone, built on my ideas and my execution. When the time came for my mother to understand the truth, I wanted facts, not arguments. I wanted timestamps and signatures and contracts that showed exactly who had built this company. The emotional satisfaction of this quiet preparation felt almost as good as the success itself. I was constructing an airtight case against her narrative, one document at a time. The first crack appeared when my mother started bragging prematurely. A colleague of hers had mentioned seeing my company's name in the news, and she'd immediately claimed insider knowledge. Within days she was telling friends I was basically a CEO now, spreading the news before I was ready for that level of exposure. I'd found out through a mutual family friend who'd texted congratulations I didn't understand yet. The anger had been immediate and consuming. She craved credit more than connection, validation more than relationship. This realization, though painful, clarified everything. Our relationship had always been transactional for her. I was either an embarrassment or a trophy, nothing in between. The timing was terrible too. We were in delicate negotiations with a potential partner, and premature publicity could have derailed everything. I'd spent hours on damage control, crafting statements and managing expectations. My team had pulled through brilliantly, but the vulnerability of the moment had been terrifying. My mother's need for attention had nearly cost me everything, and she didn't even know it. She never knew when she was causing harm. That was perhaps the saddest truth of all. Victoria had approached me differently after that. Her curiosity finally piqued. "So this hobby of yours," she'd said over coffee, her tone trying for casualness and missing by miles. "Can I see what you've been working on?" I'd given her controlled access, showing her just enough to satisfy her questions without revealing the full scope. Watching her face as she realized the scale of what I'd built had been intoxicating. Her jaw had literally dropped. The smugness she'd worn for years cracked and crumbled right there in the coffee shop. "Harlow, this is..." "I didn't realize." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Part of me had wanted to gloat, to throw every dismissive comment back in her face. But I'd simply smiled and changed the subject, letting the reality speak for itself. Her jealousy was palpable in the days that followed. She started mentioning me in conversations with her own colleagues, trying to attach herself to my rising star. The family dynamics were shifting, power redistributing in ways no one had anticipated. And I was controlling the narrative finally for the first time in my life. The social media leak happened on a Thursday afternoon. An excited team member had posted about our latest milestone, accidentally tagging me as CEO in a public post. Within hours, my notifications had exploded. Messages from old classmates, distant relatives, former professors, everyone suddenly interested in my life. I'd had to navigate the fallout with careful dignity, confirming my role while redirecting attention to the team and the work itself. But my mother had seized the moment like she'd been waiting for it. Her social media presence, usually limited to garden photos and recipe shares, suddenly featured lengthy posts about her daughter, the CEO. She'd written paragraphs about my journey, narrating a version of events that bore no resemblance to reality. Friends and family commented with heart emojis and congratulations, feeding her delusion. I'd read every word, my smile growing colder with each fabrication. This was it, the moment I'd been simultaneously dreading and anticipating. She was publicly claiming credit, cementing her false narrative for everyone to see. But she didn't realize she was also creating evidence of her own delusion, a record of lies I could dismantle whenever I chose. My mentor, Professor Hannah Grant, had been my anchor through everything. Over coffee at her university office, I'd finally confided the full story. My family's dismissal, my secret work, my mother's betrayal. She'd listened with the focused attention that had made her such a legendary teacher, then spoke words that reshaped my perspective. "Harlow, your resilience isn't despite your circumstances. It's the purest expression of who you are." She'd seen past my anger to something deeper, something worth celebrating. Her validation meant more than 1,000 investor meetings because it came without agenda or ulterior motive. Professor Grant had believed in me when I was just another student with wild ideas, and she believed in me still. That conversation had given me the emotional foundation I needed for what was coming. My rise was real, independent, and unstoppable, not because I'd proven my mother wrong, but because I'd proven myself right. The audience of my life wasn't my family anymore. It was the people I'd chosen, the team I'd built, and the future I was creating. That shift in perspective felt like breaking free from chains I hadn't fully realized I was wearing. The charity gala arrived with the weight of destiny. It was a high-profile event, the kind where local business leaders and politicians mingled over champagne and silent auctions. I'd been invited as a featured guest, my company's success making me suddenly interesting to people who'd never given me a second glance. My mother had, predictably, insisted on attending as my guest. She'd arrived in a new dress, her hair professionally styled, radiating pride that felt like theft. The ballroom glittered with crystal and ambition, conversations buzzing around us like static electricity. When the MC introduced me during the program, spotlighting my achievements and my company's growth, I felt every eye in the room shift to our table. My mother had beamed, actually glowed, as if the applause was somehow for her. She'd reached over to squeeze my hand, a gesture of connection she hadn't offered in years. The moment had been surreal, standing on the edge of complete exposure while she remained oblivious to how badly she'd misjudged everything. The tension was exquisite, a drawn bowstring waiting for release. But I'd smiled graciously, thanked the audience and sat back down, letting the evening unspool at its own pace. During the cocktail hour, I'd stepped away to take a call from an investor. When I returned, I'd caught the tail end of my mother's conversation with a woman I recognized as a local journalist. "She's brilliant, of course," my mother was saying, her voice carrying just enough for me to hear. "But I like to think I shaped her. All those tough conversations when she was younger, they built character." The words had landed like physical blows. My stomach twisted as I stood there, frozen and invisible. She genuinely believed it. In her mind, criticism equaled guidance, neglect equaled character building. The narrative she'd constructed wasn't malicious. That would have been easier to fight. It was delusional, a rewriting of history so complete she'd convinced herself of its truth. I turned away before she could see me, my vision blurring with angry tears I refused to shed publicly. The audience of my internal narrative, the readers of my story, deserved to see this moment for what it was. Proof that she was irrelevant to my success. She'd been an obstacle I'd overcome, not a force that had shaped me. The distinction mattered. It was everything. Later that evening, a journalist from the business section approached me with questions about my rapid rise. "How did you do it?" she'd asked, her recorder ready, her interest genuine. I'd smiled and launched into the truth. My incredible team, our innovative approach, the risks we'd calculated carefully, and the mentors who'd guided me when I needed direction. I'd thanked investors by name, praised my early employees' dedication, and acknowledged the luck of timing that had worked in our favor. What I hadn't mentioned, conspicuously, deliberately, was family. My mother had hovered nearby, smiling for anyone who glanced her way, playing the role of proud parent for the cameras she imagined were always watching. The journalist had thanked me and moved on, but the omission hung in the air between my mother and me like smoke. Her smile had wavered slightly, some instinct warning her that something was off. But she'd recovered quickly, her ego too strong to let doubt take root. Watching her maintain that false confidence had been fascinating. The cracks were starting to show hairline fractures in the foundation of her delusion. The sibling betrayal came via email, forwarded to me by a concerned colleague. Victoria had reached out to a competitor, offering insider insights about my company in exchange for a consulting position. The email was a masterclass in manipulation. She positioned herself as someone with unique access to my thinking and strategy. My hands had shaken as I'd read it, not from hurt but from cold fury. I'd called her immediately, my voice steady despite the rage coursing through me. "We need to talk. Now." The coffee shop meeting had been tense and brief. I'd laid out printed copies of the email chain, watching the color drain from her face. "This is what happens," I'd said quietly, "when you underestimate people." She tried to stammer explanations, excuses about her own career struggles and feeling overshadowed. I'd listened impassively, then laid down consequences. Any further betrayal would result in legal action, and her access to me and my company was permanently revoked. The composure I'd maintained throughout had clearly rattled her more than shouting would have. Viewers of my life story, if they existed, would have felt the thrill of justified confrontation executed with perfect dignity. I hadn't stooped to her level. I'd simply reminded her that actions had consequences. I'd overheard my mother's frustration by a complete accident. I'd arrived early for a family dinner, let myself in with my old key, and heard voices from the back patio. My mother and her best friend, sharing wine and confidence in the cool evening. "She's gone too far," my mother was saying, her voice tight with irritation. "Everything's so professional now, so controlled. I can't even take credit anymore without sounding ridiculous." Her friend had made sympathetic noises, but I'd heard the skepticism underneath. The satisfaction I'd felt in that moment was dark and complete. The woman who'd belittled every dream I'd ever shared now felt powerless, locked out of the success she tried to claim. I'd retreated to my car, sitting in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could compose myself enough to go inside. Revenge, I was discovering, wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet moments like this, where the natural consequences of someone's actions finally caught up to them. I hadn't engineered her exclusion maliciously. I'd simply built something without her, and now she was facing the reality that she was irrelevant to my story. That truth was more devastating than anything I could have planned. The partnership announcement was the kind of victory that changed trajectories. A Fortune 500 company wanted to integrate our technology into their existing platform, a deal that would multiply our reach exponentially. The contract negotiations had been brutal, but we'd emerged with terms that respected our vision and secured our future. I'd been invited to present the partnership at an international conference in Singapore as the keynote speaker. When the invitation arrived, I'd stared at it for a solid 5 minutes, letting the reality sink in. My mother had asked to come, not to support me, but to be seen at a prestigious international event with her successful daughter. I'd agreed, curious to see how she'd navigate a space where everyone knew the truth of my journey. At the conference, she'd worked the room like a politician's wife, introducing herself as Harlow Jennings' mother, to anyone who'd listen. I'd watched from across the reception hall, my smile polite and professional, knowing that my keynote speech tomorrow would make the truth crystal clear. This was controlled victory, success on my terms, with witnesses who couldn't be manipulated by her revisionist history. The private confrontation happened in my hotel suite after the conference concluded. My mother had requested a moment to talk, her tone suggesting she expected another opportunity to bask in reflected glory. Instead, I'd handed her a folder. Inside were contracts with my signature, investor letters praising my vision, press clippings quoting my strategy, and employee testimonials about my leadership. "These are the people who built this company," I'd said calmly. "Notice anything missing?" She'd flipped through the pages, confusion clouding her face, then slowly transforming to understanding. "Harlow, you told me to grow up and stop dreaming," I'd continued, my voice steady. "You dismissed every idea, mocked every ambition, and made me feel worthless for wanting more. These documents prove that everything I've achieved happened despite you, not because of you." She'd tried to argue, to reframe her criticism as tough love, but the evidence was irrefutable. Watching her stumble over justifications had been cathartic in ways I hadn't anticipated. This wasn't cruelty, it was correction. The audience of this story, the people who'd been watching my rise, deserved this moment of clarity. The underdog had found her voice. Victoria's consequences arrived through professional channels. Word had spread about her attempt to leverage my company for personal gain, and her reputation in our industry had taken a serious hit. A colleague mentioned that she'd been passed over for a promotion she'd been certain to receive. The ripple effects of my growth were touching every toxic family member who'd underestimated me, not because I'd orchestrated their downfall but because truth had a way of emerging. Victoria had sent a text, just 2 words, "I'm sorry." I'd stared at it for a long time before responding. Actions matter more than words. Work on being the person you want people to see. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it wasn't cruelty either. I'd learned that true power wasn't about crushing people. It was about maintaining integrity, while they faced the natural consequences of their choices. The emotional high came from knowing I'd stayed true to myself throughout everything. My hands were clean. My conscience was clear. And the story was building toward something bigger than revenge or vindication. It was building toward peace. Hosting my own gala had been my team's idea, but I'd embraced it completely. We'd rented an art gallery downtown, invited our investors, partners, mentors, and key media contacts. The invitation list was carefully curated. People who'd actually contributed to our journey, who'd believed and invested and worked alongside me. My mother had received an invitation, of course. Not inviting her would have been petty, but she'd arrived to find herself surrounded by people who knew the real story, who'd witnessed my struggles and celebrated my victories in real time. During my keynote speech, I'd thank specific people by name. Professor Grant for her mentorship, Alexandria Foster for believing in my vision, and my team members for their dedication and innovation. I'd spoken about the lonely nights, the moments of doubt, the decision to build something without safety nets or guaranteed support. Independence, I'd concluded, isn't just about financial success. It's about defining yourself on your own terms, regardless of who believes in you. The applause had been thunderous. My mother had clapped too, but her smile had been strained, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She'd finally understood what everyone else in the room already knew. She was a guest in my story, not its author. In the weeks following the gala, my mother's friends had started approaching her differently. I'd heard about it through family channels. Apparently, they'd been asking her advice about their own daughters' careers, expecting wisdom she couldn't provide. She'd struggled to answer questions about how she'd raised such a successful child, her usual confidence evaporating under specific inquiries. The reality was becoming impossible to deny. She hadn't raised me to succeed. She'd accidentally taught me to succeed in spite of her, which was an entirely different lesson. I'd felt no particular triumph in her humbling. By that point, my focus had shifted completely to the future. New partnerships, expansion plans, and the incredible team we'd assembled. My mother had become background noise in the story of my life, relevant only in explaining where I'd started, not where I was going. She'd called once to attempt a conversation about our journey together. I listened politely, then gently corrected her pronouns. My journey, I'd said. This has always been my journey. She'd been quiet for a long moment before changing the subject. Progress, I supposed, came in small acknowledgments. The story closed on a warm evening 6 months later. I stood on my apartment terrace. The city skyline spread before me like a promise kept. My company had exceeded every projection, my team was thriving, and I'd finally stopped checking my phone anxiously for the next crisis. I'd built a life defined by independence, respect, and genuine achievement. Family dynamics no longer controlled my emotional state or influenced my decisions. My mother and I had settled into a distant but cordial relationship, built on truth rather than delusion. She'd stopped claiming credit, and I'd stopped needing her acknowledgement. The fire that had driven me through years of secret work and public triumph had transformed into something quieter and more sustainable: contentment. I'd proven everything I'd needed to prove, not to my family but to myself. The girl who'd been told to stop dreaming had built an empire from those dreams. The ultimate payoff wasn't revenge or vindication. It was this: standing in the life I'd created, surrounded by people who'd chosen to be there, feeling genuinely at peace. Success tasted exactly like freedom, and I'd savor every moment.